Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Calley, coming to you from the Ionia County office of SBAM, otherwise known as my basement. Great to see you all after a great holiday week.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Miller. Thanks for joining us today. And thanks for letting us have the week off last week. I know Brian and I both enjoyed a vacation, and it was a nice break, but we're happy to be back with you today. We want to welcome one of our newer members, Q-Line Media from Detroit. So welcome to Aisha Quresh, the owner of Q-Line Media and her team. And of course, we're welcoming them on behalf of our sponsor, Consumers Credit Union. So Brian, on our last show, I was joined by Kelly Saunders, and we did a deep dive into the budget. But one of the things we didn't get a chance to talk about was the Pure Michigan campaign budget, which seemingly has been eviscerated. What can you tell us?
Yeah, this was a surprise to a lot of people, really was not on the radar screen. And as I tried to do some checking into it, is one of these weird things where nobody wants to own this cut. Nobody's saying, hey, it was my idea to reduce the Pure Michigan budget line item. Now, this is something that SBAM has long supported ever since, going back. This has been the third administration now that the Pure Michigan brand has been a major part of how Michigan presents itself to the rest of the country, and in fact to the world. Much more than a tourism brand. That's what it's most known for, but really this is Michigan's brand. And there's a staff behind this brand. There's advertising that happens, and of course the tourism promotions are a really big part of that. In this last budget with federal dollars, remember with the pandemic, the dollars, the spending in Pure Michigan naturally went down because there wasn't tourism that was even allowed during a lot of that time period. But in coming out of it, it was back, and then there was federal money got added to it. So it's coming off a year where the budget was $40 million. But we knew that about 10 million or so of that was federal dollars that were not recurring. And so we kind of expected that it would be back to that 30 million or so range. And when the budget was finally passed, then and the dust settled on it, and you could kind of go through these thousands of line items. It came out at 15 million. Now, 15 million, it hasn't been that small since the end of the Granholm administration. You might recall it's a totally different time. The state was in recession. The state was operating on a budget that was roughly half the size that it is right now. So it was less than $50 billion. In fact, 2011, I think the budget was $46 billion, and today it's $82 billion. So it hasn't been this small since way back then. And so it's kind of a surprise. The reason that we pay a lot of attention to this is partly because it's the brand of the state, the place where we operate, how the state does overall is important for the economy, for the workforce, but also the tourism industry itself is dominated by small businesses, and so it's a really important factor. And by the way, it is not just an up north thing. Sometimes people think of Pure Michigan as being up north. About 45% of the Pure Michigan spending is actually the lower part of the state, including promoting places like Detroit, our biggest city, and Grand Rapids. It's really a really big part of the tourism of our state is lower Michigan too, and that's a kind of a misnomer. Sometimes think, oh, that's the thing for up north. It's up north is a big part of it, of Pure Michigan, but that's not all of it. So here we are at 15 million starting in September, which would really require scaling back in a lot of activities. So we'll go to work and try to get that back up to what we would consider full funding in that $30 million range for the Pure Michigan campaign moving forward. So stay tuned. This was kind of a surprise setback. But the way that people are kind of distancing themselves from it, like, well, hey, it was a big budget. This was one line item. I didn't really like that was getting cut, tells me that the next time a supplemental goes through, that maybe there'll be an opportunity to get it back up at that rightful level.
All right, definitely work toward that goal. So there's a new proposal for a film credit, and Michigan used to have a film incentive. So is this new credit that they're proposing similar?
Yeah, this is it's a bit of a different twist on it. So Michigan had a very, very large film credit before let's see, during, I don't know, the very end of the first decade of the century. So like, 2008, 9, 10, like that time period, and into 2011, I believe. And then when the tax code was simplified, and the overall tax rate was reduced on business taxes in particular, the that at that time, a lot of the credits, including the film incentive, went away. Now there's a new proposal that's actually looks like it's gaining a little bit of steam and attention to bring back the film credit in a different form. That was one of the criticisms of the original, was that it was a production. It would cover production costs, but really kind of fly by night. So Hollywood production studio could come in, make a movie, and then most of the credit went to people that really aren't from here. So they would come in, make the movie, and then leave. And so what this credit is restructured a bit, in that it tries to get at that, to have preference for hiring in people in state, and credit given for that upwards of 25 or 30%, depending on some factors. So it's a big credit. Here's the other thing, though, is that before it was kind of a cash rebate direct to the taxpayer if they had zero tax liability. In this case, it's an assignable credit. So presumably the credits would always be used by Michigan firms. So kind of a complicated description, I know, from it, but the point is that this is something that had been in Michigan's tax code at one point in the past, and is getting some play, and perhaps be something to keep an eye on for this fall. And the other thing I was going to mention too is that before, when this was in place, media production was looked at in a certain way. It was film and TV, but now streaming and content providers, and that come in a lot of different forms that don't go through what we would traditionally consider like film making. So even kind of how this is styled or described, it's now, this act that's being proposed would be called the Multimedia Jobs Act. So we started out, and me being kind of a long-termer in and around the system, I called it a film credit. That's what it was called before. But this is really aimed at kind of a wider Multimedia Jobs Act approach. And so we'll see where that goes. It's something it's different enough from before, I think, to make it interesting, a different type of conversation than on the previous that was scrapped back in 2011, I believe.
Okay. As we were talking about the topics for today's show, this one was news to me. And it's that UPS might go on strike. So what can you tell us about the discussions UPS is having and what the impact could be?
Yeah, this is one of those areas that could be very, very disruptive in terms of our overall economy, because UPS has such a huge footprint when it comes to our overall transportation of things, of goods across our system. In fact, it's estimated about 6% of the US GDP is transported by UPS. And I don't know if 6% sounds like a lot to you, but like in terms of the US economy, that is a massive, massive number. Over the holiday week and right into July 4th, discussions, negotiations between management and the Teamsters, so this would be the Teamsters Brotherhood, those discussions broke down, and the way that the union described it was that preparations for going into strike went into overdrive, in their words. So really gearing up for the possibility of a strike. If that did happen, they do have a lot of leverage, because if that did happen, it would have a pretty massive impact on the overall just economic direction of the country. And these transportation strikes are things that are starting to come up a little bit more often. So you saw even the president get involved in trying to settle the Amtrak um, rail strike possibility before. We've seen around the world, especially in Europe, on rail in particular, seeing some really tough negotiations that are happening. So I wouldn't say it could be just posturing, the idea that they say their strike preparations are going into overdrive, but really the two sides are still very far apart. And so they've got, this contract doesn't run out until for a few more weeks, I believe. I was going to mention too, 340,000 workers. That's how many people that we're talking about here. So it's a massive, huge logistical system, and one that our economy relies on quite a bit. So definitely keep your eye out on in the news for what's happening with UPS.
All right, now let's move on to a cars report. How are car sales doing?
Yeah, this is, of course, Michigan has a lot of eggs in this basket, putting more eggs in it all the time. So the good news is that that a Michigan-based company, a U.S.-based company, is still on top. So General Motors, for a while, a few years ago, it looked like they might be knocked out of that #1 spot. In fact, I think for a little while, for a very short period of time, they were, when production slowed during the pandemic. But they're really back on top. So they reported a 19% sales gain just this last week when they reported their second quarter numbers, so through June. And it dominated the U.S. industry with for year to date 1.3 million vehicles sold. So very good news for General Motors. And looking at their just digging into some of the details, they sold 581,000 pickups and large SUVs. So that's definitely the biggest part of their sales, 45% of their total sales, in fact. And then Ford also reported their numbers too, and they maintained their #2 spot in the U.S. economy, or the U.S. Car sales. And it was primarily led by their internal combustion engine pickup trucks. So the regular gas pickups, although they are investing a lot in battery that is essentially being financed by their regular pickup sales, and their total sales climbed 11.2%. So not as much as General Motors, but still quite a bit. And it was 538 vehicles in the second quarter of 2023, and that puts them up 10% for the first half of the year. Year to date, just over 1 million. So to remind you, General Motors about 1.3 million vehicles sold. Ford at just over 1 million vehicles sold. So in very strong position. The internal combustion engine vehicle sales. So Ford is kind of interesting. They when they make these reports, they separate out the battery business from the combustible engine, still up 10%. So I mean, that's definitely pretty big. And 10% for the quarter, and 10%, a little over 10% year to date. Electric vehicle sales actually did drop a little bit, and down 2.8% to 14,843 vehicles for the same period. Hybrid vehicles climbed, and that's really where Ford had concentrated in recent times, was on hybrid vehicles as opposed to all electric. So the industry is changing quite a bit, but as there's a lot of investment happening in this transfer of over to electrification of vehicles, the two Michigan-based domestic automakers, they're still doing quite well. And I think that's especially impressive considering that interest rates are higher. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get to Data Monday, but but really not pretty, very impressive numbers from both Ford and GM.
All right, and with that, it actually is time for our Data Monday report.
Yeah, so let's take a look. This is kind of what I consider in terms of Data Monday to be the big one, if you will. In that it has this is the week when we have the big reports that come out. So the first thing I wanted to point out was the jobs report, what's commonly referred to as the jobs report. So U.S. payrolls up 209,000, and that's pretty close to what analysts had expected. Now, if you're to look here at this, you'll see that it is kind of generally trending downward. That is by design. Remember, interest rates are being increased to cool off the job market, which is driving inflation. Okay, so looking at this, it's a very moderate decline that you see happening generally over the last year, and not quite as fast probably as some of the policymakers would like to see. But of course, there was a lot of stimulus put into the U.S. economy during the pandemic, and still a fair amount of cash out there. Looking at the different sectors, these are the same. This is the same set of data in two different ways. On the left side of the screen, you have the industries, and then on the right side of the screen, it's by sector. But if you look at a lot of the action is still in the service industry. So government is in there. I always chuckle a little bit. The government is a service industry, but technically, yes, it is. And but education and health coming in at the biggest gains, and then government right behind that. But professional and business services, which had been softer for a while, up. Leisure and hospitality up. Other services up. Financial activities. So a lot of action. Retail, transportation, and warehousing, and wholesale trade being some of those that were actually down. Looking at the unemployment rate, this is 3.6%. It was 3.7% last month, so it's actually down a little bit. Michigan's is actually below 4% now too, which is pretty low. It's complicated because the numerator and the denominator, they're not both moving in the right direction, but overall the unemployment rate is at a very low level. And then looking at job openings, so this would be the total, all the industries combined. And you'll see that while there is generally a bit of a downward trend here, again, some softening of the overall economic activity, it's still quite high. And when you look at the total numbers year over year, the jobless claims, just look at jobless numbers in a couple of different ways. So if we've got in this case, we've got the jobless claims kind of moving in two different directions when it comes to those that are continuing and those that are initial. So in the blue, you'll see the initial jobs claims. You have to, how to describe this, you have to recertify every week. And in the blue, you see those that are new. And in the orange, you see those that are continuing that had already been on unemployment. So you can see them moving in different directions. That continuing is going down, and the new is going up. And now looking at another way of looking at the unemployment numbers, both fairly low. You've got those that were laid off and the job eliminated, so permanent job losers, that's in blue. And then the number of temporary layoffs, so people that lost their jobs, but it was in a classification that means that those jobs would be coming back. You'll notice that because of the pandemic and these big spikes, back here with the last recession and then this big spike, it makes the scale kind of difficult, even big moves or respectable moves in real time. They look very small, but the number of unemployed, the temporary unemployment layoffs is actually up a bit. and but the permanent job losers down. The quits rate, this is always an interesting one, a sign of how confident people are. How many people quit their job? 2.6 people quit in the last month. And as you can see, that's a little bit, just slightly higher than it was last month, but it's kind of in the same general range. Now, the number of people who voluntarily left their job as a percentage of the total unemployed, 13.2%, is actually up just a little bit from last month. And then unemployment duration, looking at this in two different ways. So this is looking at unemployment of 27 weeks and over. Both of these lines are 27 weeks and older, so more than half of a year. And so long-term unemployment, and looking at the blue, that's a percentage of the total of those unemployed. So 18.5% of those unemployed have been unemployed for 6 months. And now remember, the total number of people unemployed is relatively small right now, but of those, about 1 in 5 of those have been more than 6 months. And then it's at kind of an absolute numbers, looking at it in orange. Now, the labor force participation, everything was exactly the same. It was even Steven across the board. So the total stayed at 62.6% for the nation. About 2% behind that is where Michigan is today. Labor force participation among men, that's what you see in orange, stayed the same. Among women in purple, that also stayed the same. So, but by age categories where you see some movement. And this is what I would say is, the kind of good news, bad news, if you will, of the labor force participation rate, is that the those that are 25 to 54 years old, so post high school, kind of that prime working age, it is up to 83.5%. That's actually an all-time high. That's pretty good. Now, the total number of people in that cohort is smaller than it used to be, because like my generation, Gen X, is a really small generation. But go Gen X, we're workers. But millennials and Gen X into this category at this point, 83.5% labor force participation. But among those that are 55 years and older, labor force participation is down, and it's actually continued to move down. So it plummeted at the pandemic. It made a bit of a recovery, and it's been trending downward. So this is an area that we're really, it's kind of taking the edge off, or I should say, kind of muting, if you will, the increase in the 25 to 54-year-olds, because those over 55 has dropped and has continued to fall lower. Wages up. So when you look at it across the board, all employees, this is the U.S. average hourly earnings. It's how they consider hourly earnings, but it's really all employees, all those on payrolls, and that's up 4.4%. So had been going down, kind of leveled out here. And then looking at it on a month over month, same exact data, but month over month, you see that wages up 0.4% over the month. So it really is I would say, the type of report that would show, and kind of looking forward to the Federal Reserve meeting that's coming up at the end of this month. Still, the June inflation numbers will come out. We'll talk about those next week. I think we'll see those at the end of this week. So some of the inflation numbers will come out then. There'll be some others that come out. There's two sets of them ahead of this meeting. But there's nothing in these jobs numbers that would tell me that the Federal Reserve would change course of what they're already doing, or rethink the direction that they're headed in. And the direction that they're headed in is that in July, there'll be another 0.25% increase in the interest rates. So I think they would look at this and say, you know what, everything's moderating. Things are kind of gliding down, but the labor market is still really at a point where inflation could come back at a higher level. It's been about cut in half from where it was at its highest point. But everything about this is a really kind of moderate set of statistics. It would reinforce the thinking that the Federal Reserve has. And so I would say look for another 1/4% increase by the end of the month.
All right, a couple of programming notes. First of all, the small business briefing will be Mondays only through Labor Day. So there will be no show this Thursday, but we will be in Detroit on Thursday for one of our owner-to-owner networking events at Harry's Detroit Bar and Grill. So if you're in the Detroit area, please visit our website, sbam.org/events, so that you can register to attend that. We'll be in Lansing later this month as well. So thanks for joining us today. We'll be back here next Monday, July 17th. Have a wonderful week.
Thanks, everybody. See you next week.